There is a door in the back of a social club on Mulberry Street. From the sidewalk it looks like nothing. A beaded curtain, a haze of cigar smoke, old men playing cards under bare bulb. But behind that door, for almost a century, young men have been asked the same question, in one form or another. Are you willing to disappear? Not literally, not yet. They are asked to give up their old name, their old friends, sometimes their own family, in exchange for a promise of protection and power. Most say yes. Almost none of them understand in that moment exactly what they are agreeing to. This is the story of how an ordinary person becomes one of the most feared men in the American underworld. Not through luck, not through violence alone, through a sequence of calculated steps, refined over 100 years of organized crime that turn a nobody into a boss. And almost without exception, those same steps eventually destroy him. Stage 1 begins with proof. Before a new recruit is trusted with anything real, he has to demonstrate exactly one thing: silence. He runs errands, he collects small debts, he drives men to meetings and waits outside without asking questions. He watches everything and repeats none of it. It sounds simple. It isn't. For decades, nobody outside the organization knew how that silence was enforced, because nobody who had taken the oath had ever broken it. Then, in 1963, a low-ranking soldier named Joseph Valachi did something that had never been done. Testifying before a Senate committee investigating organized crime, he described an induction ceremony most Americans had never heard of. A ritual involving a burning holy card, held in cupped hands while the initiate recited an oath binding him to the organization until death. The oath had one line that mattered more than any other: what happens inside this family stays inside this family forever, on penalty of death. That silence is the price of entry. Fail it, and there is no second chance. Keep it, and you move to Stage 2. Stage 2 is territory. Every boss starts small, a few blocks, a handful of businesses paying for protection they never asked for. During Prohibition, a young enforcer in Chicago named Al Capone built an empire this way, and he did it by being organized, not just violent. He understood that a neighborhood isn't controlled by fear alone, it's controlled by relationships. The beat cop who looks the other way, the alderman who needs campaign money, the bar owner who needs product nobody else can supply. Territory isn't taken in a single night. It's built block by block, favor by favor, over years. And once it exists, it has to be defended, which is where the calculation starts to get dangerous. Because territory attracts rivals, and every rising boss eventually has to answer a question he can't avoid. What are you willing to do to keep what's yours? Stage 3 is the alliance, and it's far more fragile than it looks from the outside. No one rises alone. Every boss needs lieutenants, allies, men who owe him favors and men he owes favors to in return. These alliances hold the entire structure together, but they run on a currency that's far less stable than money: trust. And in this world, trust has an expiration date nobody can see coming. By 1930, tension between two of New York's most powerful bosses, Joe Mafia and Salvatore Maranzano, had hardened into open conflict. Historians would later call it the Castellammarese War. Caught in the middle were younger men who had grown tired of two aging bosses refusing to share power. One of them started asking a dangerous question: what if neither of the old men was necessary anymore? His name was Charles Luciano. History remembers him as Lucky. Stage 4 is the hardest to talk about, and the hardest stage to walk back from once it begins: elimination. In April of 1931, Joe Mafia was gunned down at a restaurant in Coney Island, reportedly moments after the men he'd arrived with stepped away from the table. The men suspected of arranging it were, by most accounts, his own trusted associates. Luciano didn't stop there. Within months, Maranzano was dead too, killed in his own office by men who walked in posing as government agents. With both old bosses gone, Luciano didn't crown himself king. He did something smarter, and far more dangerous to the men who came after him. Stage 5 is structure, and it's the stage most outsiders get completely wrong. They assume organized crime is chaos. It isn't. In the aftermath of 1931, Luciano helped establish what would become known simply as the Commission, a governing council of family bosses designed to settle disputes without war, divide territory without bloodshed, and run the entire enterprise less like a street gang and more like a corporation with a board of directors. At this stage, a boss isn't the most violent man in the room anymore. He's the most reliable one. The man who keeps his word, resolves conflict quietly, and makes the business of crime look almost like the business of business. Which brings us to Stage 6, image. By the 1980s, the model had shifted again. Law enforcement was watching more closely than it ever had, and the smartest bosses understood that reputation could be a weapon or a liability, depending entirely on how it was managed. No one demonstrated this better than John Gotti, head of the Gambino crime family, who cultivated a public persona so sharp, custom suits, headline-grabbing court appearances, a wide, confident smile for the cameras, that newspapers gave him a nickname usually reserved for cookware, the Teflon Don. Nothing, it seemed, could stick to him. For a while, nothing did. He beat 3 separate criminal trials across the 1980s. He became something rare in his world, famous. And fame, it turns out, is the most dangerous stage of all. Why? Because the same visibility that builds a legend also builds a target. Every headline, every acquittal, every magazine cover made Gotti a bigger prize for the people trying to bring him down. The FBI didn't need him to make a mistake in public. They needed someone close enough to hear him make one in private. They found that person in Salvatore Gravano, known on the street as Sammy the Bull, Gotti's own underboss, the second most powerful man in the family. Which brings us finally to stage 7, the fall. In 1991, facing his own murder charges, Gravano made a decision that would end the Gotti era for good. He agreed to testify against his own boss. Combined with FBI recordings taken from a bugged apartment above a Mulberry Street social club, his testimony gave prosecutors something nearly a decade of failed trials hadn't: an insider's account, in granular detail, of orders given and murders committed. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted on charges including murder and racketeering. He would die in federal prison roughly a decade later, having never breathed free air again. It's worth asking why this keeps happening. Different decades, different families, different cities, and yet the ending is almost always the same. The very structure that makes a man powerful enough to reach the top is the same structure that eventually takes him down. The associates who prove their loyalty are the ones positioned to later prove their disloyalty. The alliances that build an empire are the ones that dissolve it. The visibility that builds a legend is the same visibility that hands the government its case. There's an old line among the law enforcement agents who spent entire careers chasing these organizations: there is no version of this story with a retirement plan. Which brings us back to that door on Mulberry Street, the beaded curtain, the haze of cigar smoke, a young man standing outside it being asked, without ever hearing the words out loud, whether he's willing to disappear. He doesn't know yet what waits on the other side of 7 stages: the territory, the alliances, the war, the structure, the fame, and finally the fall that comes sooner or later for almost everyone who walks through that door. He only knows the door is open, and somewhere behind it, someone is waiting for his answer.